Ok, benissimo. Allora possiamo cominciare. We can begin, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to another appointment on this series of international video conferences. This one will be the last one before the Christmas break. Then we'll take 1 month of break, and we come back with another batch of presentations. We are just preparing the list, and we'll let it published in the next days. Tonight we have Tony Schill from the USA. He lives in Buffalo, but he was born in Pittsburgh, so he's an expert of the tram system of that important city. This is the third appointment because he has already given 2 speeches on that subject, but this third one will deal in particular on the interurban part of the network and on the funiculars in Pittsburgh. Of course, the speech will be in English, but there is space for any of you that wants to go on a chat, and at the end of the evening there will be a space for any questions and answers, of course. Before giving the floor to Tony, I have to repeat everything in Italian, sorry. Buonasera a tutti, benvenuti a quest'ultimo appuntamento della serie internazionale di videoconferenze tranviarie del mondo. Questa sera abbiamo Tony Schill da Pittsburgh, Stati Uniti d'America, che ci parlerà delle tranvie interurbane e delle funicolari di questa importante città tranviaria. Questa è la terza parte, in realtà, di una sua presentazione più ampia, perché aveva cominciato a parlare della rete urbana e ora conclude con la parte interurbana. La presentazione sarà in inglese, per tutta la durata della presentazione ci sarà a disposizione la chat dove potrete fare interventi, alla fine consueto spazio per domande e risposte. Il calendario delle prossime presentazioni non è ancora pubblicato, ma lo faremo nei prossimi giorni e riprenderemo da fine gennaio. Benissimo, adesso do la parola a Tony. Tony, if you want, you can begin. You can start.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Merry Christmas to Happy Holidays, whichever you prefer to use. As Roberto said, I was born in Pittsburgh, lived there till I was about late teens, and was very familiar with the Pittsburgh Railways Company that existed at that time. Unfortunately, the Interurbans were almost entirely gone before I was even born, but I've taken an interest in those just like the city streetcar systems. Got a lot of pictures to go through of stuff that I never really saw in any great amount, the Interurbans and the inclines, and I hope you enjoy this. First, I have to ask Roberto, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, outstanding. So what we're going to do is first we'll go through the inclines, and then we'll go to the Interurbans, and I'll talk about the Interurbans when we get there. The incline portion is not all that long. Now we're going to see if it's always a little bit of trepidation when I do these programs. So let's see what happens when I push this button. Nothing. Let's see. How about this button? Hey, Roberto, it's not liking me. Let's, no. Doesn't, are you looking at my cover slide there?
Yeah, I am looking at the first one.
Yeah, now how do I get it to move?
One on 259.
Yeah, but I can't seem to get the, oh, okay, now we go. All right. First, we start with a little disclaimer. Uh, all these slides are, almost all of them are extremely old. I get them off the internet or out of books or whatever. Uh, I just want to use a disclaimer that, in the United States, as long as you do something for educational purposes, you're pretty much able to reproduce stuff without permission of the original owner, most of whom are dead anyway. But I just want to recognize the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum and the Trolley Dodger. Harvey probably knows the guy. Uh, he posts
Yeah.
a lot of stuff for sale on the internet, and they're good quality stuff, and I make a lot of use of them. So let's proceed. So we go to Pittsburgh. As you'll see, Pittsburgh is very hilly. It's built on the banks of three rivers, and a very difficult environment for streetcar operations. And the hills can be quite high, up to about 650 meters, and they really impede, even today, they impede mobility in the area. A lot of us that grew up in Pittsburgh tend to think that if you're not born there and spend a lot of time, it will take you forever to figure out how to get around. Of course, now with automated navigation systems, it's a lot easier. But if you just used a map, it may look like two streets are very close to each other, but they're not anywhere near each other in the vertical plane. So it takes people a while to get used to it. The biggest hill is right downtown, across the river from what's called downtown the Golden Triangle, and it started out as Coal Hill. Uh, they discovered in the 1700s that there was coal in the mountain, in the hill, and everything began there. Eventually, there was some coal mining done. It petered out, and it eventually became a residential area. But it was very difficult to reach the top, and inclines were devised, or funiculars, to get people up to the top. So here we are looking two views. The top view is from Coal Hill to downtown, and the bottom view is from downtown towards Coal Hill. The highest part of Coal Hill is right at downtown, and it slopes off somewhat to the east and west. But you're looking at the Monongahela River, which off to the left in the top view can see it joining the Allegheny, which forms the Ohio. The Ohio eventually flows to the Mississippi, and the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. And Pittsburgh's location made it what was called the gateway to the West. Once you got over the mountains from the East Coast, you could reach pretty much most of the United States, what became the United States, by boat. So Coal Hill had a number of inclines. On these dots that you see here, the red dots are passenger inclines, and the black dots are either freight or simply coal inclines, which were basically not for anything other than to let coal from the mouth of the mine down to the bank of the river. Pittsburgh had about, I will say about because there's some discussion on how many exactly there were, somewhat between 17 and 19 inclines. And we're going to go through all of the ones that are shown on this map, plus a couple others. We're going to start on Coal Hill. Here's the inclines on Coal Hill. These were built starting in 1870 and were pretty much all built by about 1900. Over the years, all of the inclines have gone away with the exception of the Monongahela and the Duquesne. They are still in operation. We had some pretty neat inclines, and we'll try to show those as we go along. Here's a view of the Smithfield Street Bridge, which was constructed in 1883 and later expanded for streetcar right-of-way. The original bridge was rebuilt in 1891 and additional space added for streetcars. It was also built with the idea that might be cable cars, but that was about the time the electric car came into Pittsburgh, and so they put electric cars on. The incline at the right is the Monongahela, which is the first incline in Pittsburgh in 1870. And over on the left is the Castle Shannon incline. And we'll go to each of these. This is the Monongahela incline, right across the Smithfield Street Bridge. On all of these, I've put the statistics up in the little charts. The freight incline is on the left, and the passenger incline on the right. The freight incline was abandoned in 1935. By that time, trucks could easily get up to the top on highways. Just a second. Another view of the Monongahela incline. The cars generally look very similar. They're in stepped configuration where the loading platforms are at different levels, so you just walk into the level for that particular section of the loading platform. I've had a few problems in recent years. This particular incline is run by the Port Authority and the same operator of the light rail and bus system. And it's had some troubles lately. A couple times it's had to be out of service for several days to make emergency repairs. And the Port Authority at one point, looking for a way out of this, suggested replacing it with an aerial cable car. That's just not going to fly in Pittsburgh. And here's another view of Monongahela. Now a little bit to the west of the Monongahela, down by the Point Bridge, here's the Point Bridge on the left of the picture, and the Duquesne incline came along a few years later. It has a gradient of 30 degrees or 59%, and it is also still in use. It's owned by the Port Authority as well, but it's operated by a preservation trust, and it's very popular. It has, I think, the best view of the city from up there at the top. So it's been running now for what, 150 years. Duquesne incline again, then and now. Maintains its historical character. Its cars have always looked pretty much the same. And this is a view from the top station. You'd have to see a picture taken 50 years ago to believe how big a change has occurred in the city in this view. Now we're going to skip back down past the Castle Shannon incline to the Knoxville incline and also the Mount Oliver. This one right in front of us that has a curve disappearing away to the right was the Knoxville incline. This is a coal incline in the center, and then the Mount Oliver incline. The Knoxville incline is 10-foot gauge and 9-foot, I'm sorry. And it lasted until about 1960. Pittsburgh Railways inherited this with the consolidation way back in 1901. Now looking down from halfway up the hill, evidently some kind of repair work is underway because there's no rails on the Knoxville incline. Now, on the left is a farther out view of a map showing the Knoxville incline in Pittsburgh was one of two that had a curve. And it was considered very unique, although I can think of plenty of other funiculars today that have curves. But it was in Pittsburgh, it was always remarked, hey, incline with a curve, big deal. And over here on the right, you see the coal mine entrance down in the lower left corner of the right-hand picture, and it would bring coal over to a dumper and load it into cars that went down the incline to be unloaded down near Carson Street in Pittsburgh. And then off to the right here is the Mount Oliver incline. And looking back up, Mount Oliver incline is out of view behind us. You see on the left the railroad for the coal mine, and down in the trench on the right is the Knoxville. Very large cars. They're meant to carry up wagons, horses and wagons. This is up at the top. The streetcar on the left is on well, it's not exactly the same track today, but there still is track there, and it is the bypass over Mount Washington for the light rail system when the trolley tunnel under Mount Washington is out of service for any reason. It was out of service this past year for about 8 months as they replaced rail in the tunnel. You notice there's streetcar track leading right into this Knoxville station. I don't know if it was used in later years, like when this picture was taken, but I did read that horse cars once were taken into the station. And there must have been electric cars go in there as well, because I see wire up there leading in. Mount Oliver incline just across the way. It's just straight up, straight down. And further to the east was the St. Clair incline. St. Clair had a little problem one day. The car got away, rushed down to the bottom, and collided with the car waiting to come up. But it stayed in business another 30 years after that. The Penn incline was probably the biggest, heaviest construction for an incline in Pittsburgh. It was not on Mount Washington. It was on the bank of the Allegheny River across downtown. And it was built to haul freight wagons full of coal up to the top of the hill above the Pennsylvania Railroad main line. And that was so the coal wagons had an easier way to get up to the residential area up on the hill where they would sell coal, and it enabled the price of coal to be substantially reduced for the customers up there. This line survived till 1953. It was 10-foot gauge. Here it is, built on a truss bridge that was just meant to carry it over the passenger yards of the Pennsylvania Railroad. The coal business didn't last too long, so the incline built that building up at the top right, which was a quasi amusement park, dance hall, you name it. And here's looking down from the top. This is about 1950. This is the passenger yard of the Pennsylvania. If you went there today, there wouldn't be a single switch in view turnout, and there'd be a total of 2 tracks. Now we go over to the Castle Shannon incline. This, I think, was probably the most interesting one. It started off in 1874 as a coal incline, and it ran into what was first a mine, where it says tunnel in the center left. That was an entrance to the mine, and later it was pushed out at the other end of the hill and connected with a railroad that was built to coal mines further down the Sawmill Run Valley. On the further up here, here's a junction over to the top of the incline, and this line went on the surface and then underneath Grandview Avenue for a distance to reach uh, what was a iron mill. It wasn't a steel mill, but it was an iron mill right across from downtown. And the coal went down an incline there to the to the coke works. Oops. And here's a view that shows where the incline would have been to the blast furnace. And this is right across from downtown. That's pretty neat. I always thought that the steel mill was downtown. So it came to pass that that was not really what they wanted. They actually had been running passenger cars. The tunnel was only 5 feet high inside. So the cars, they were practically flat cars with seats. And passengers did ride through the tunnel and over here and could go down the coal incline. That was not very satisfactory and was probably pretty unsafe since they were using steam locomotives through this tunnel. And they built the new incline. The front incline was built 1893, 1890, and a couple years later, the back incline. So you rode from down at river level up to the top of Mount Washington and then back down another incline where it met the railroad that went out to the south, Sawmill Run Valley. And this is a picture of a train on a railroad. This is at Reflectorville, which is several miles from downtown. And this bridge eventually was converted to steel and was used by Pittsburgh Railway's interurban cars. And another view of this railroad. The railroad was only about 5 miles long. And this picture showing the shops and storage building of the Pittsburgh and Castle Shannon Railroad. You see that building, the second one with the passenger cars sticking outside, 2 passenger cars. You keep that building in mind. We'll see it again later. Here are 2 views of the Castle Shannon front incline. This ran until 1964. And the picture on the left shows the passenger incline and the old coal incline, which was gone by sometime in the 20s. There's another one with big cars meant to haul wagons. The area with the row of windows is a small passenger compartment where passengers could ride and sit down. The back incline was kind of more like a cable car. It was a pretty shallow grade, and this was more, not exactly, it's not an incline car, but it's it was used to couple up to the railroad's coal cars and passenger cars and haul them up this incline to the top where passengers would get off and transfer to the down incline to go downtown. This is after it was out of business. This was taken in 1916. This is the bottom of the back incline near what is today South Hills Junction. This bridge was in existence until maybe 30 years ago, but it wasn't really obvious if you saw it. I saw it. I never knew what it was until years after that. It passed over the steam railroad connection, and you see that 3-rail track. It was a narrow gauge railroad. The 3-rail track has had a rail added, and streetcars coming from South Hills Junction could loop around and go back toward the city using the extra rail. These are pictures of the same bridge. You see they filled in under it, so it wasn't obvious what it was years before. It's been obliterated now by light rail construction. Excuse me. So by 1900, there was a trolley line built up to the top of Mount Washington and then out to Sawmill Run and to the South Hills. and that led to less and less use of the Castle Shannon incline. But it was still used for a while. Pittsburgh Railways, when they built the trolley tunnel, which is shown in red here, they realized that the route to the interurban lines to Washington and Charleroi was not going to be very satisfactory, as it would have gone through West Liberty on street trackage and then a little single track connection over to Castle Shannon and then turned to the south. So the Pittsburgh Railways planned in advance, as they were building the tunnel, to buy the Pittsburgh and Castle Shannon Steam Railroad, which they did in the middle 1900, 1905, 6, 7, somewhere in there. But they didn't immediately use it. They put a third rail in to accommodate standard gauge or Pennsylvania trolley gauge streetcars, but the narrow gauge railroad continued to operate for freight until about 1909. And then the coal traffic was removed, and Pittsburgh Railways electrified the tracks and used them as the Overbrook line, which still runs today on the interurban lines out to not to Washington and Charleroi, but about halfway through those places, Library and South Hills Village. And here I've shown the tunnel that exists today, which was practically right under the old coal mine tunnel. And when it got down here to South Hills Junction, a connection was built over to what was the former railroad. This is Pittsburgh Railways Company timetable for a steam railroad. It was still steam when this was printed. And there you see South Hills Junction, still a junction today, but not with this building, and a Pittsburgh and Castle Shannon steam train headed south to Castle Shannon. Down below there, you can see the connecting track that was built so the railways could get up to the Overbrook line. And here's the ramp up under construction about 1909. And after it was done, it looked like this. That's the building on the center left is a substation, and a big one. And the buildings to the right are the car houses, 2 different car houses for the Interurbans and city cars, and maintenance away buildings. So we say goodbye to the inclines. This is Castle Shannon just a short time before it was closed. Typical Pittsburgh gloomy day. Now that looks like it was taken a long time ago, but if you look above the car, you can see the shiny silver dome, which was the Civic Arena openable roof dome for hockey and other activities, built about 1960. It's been torn down to now also. A couple other inclines of note was the Nunnery Hill incline over on the north side, which also had a big sweeping curve in it. This only lasted a few years, and there are very few pictures of it. This is a kind of neat operation. This is the, well, the name escapes me at the moment, but it was down the river towards Beaver, and it is a funicular, but the second track is a track for a counterweight car, a counterbalance car. And because of the way the cable is arranged, it's only half as long as the actual railroad. Now, this is a streetcar and an incline car at the same time. It had a very short section of street trackage at the bottom without any cable, ran just like a conventional streetcar, and then it came on here and hooked up to the cable to be pulled up to the top of the hill. there was the reason the cable anchor track is so short is that the cable was passed around some pulleys to make the effective length of the thing the same as the full length of the track rail line cable. Okay, now we're going to transition over to the Interurbans. This is a picture that's probably pretty familiar, at least the contents of, to most trolley fans in the United States. The interurban era was confined, well, existed all over the United States, but the greatest concentration was in the northeastern and midwest parts of the country. It was possible at one time to go from the furthest point on the right of this map to the furthest point south or west entirely using electric railways. Most of them were built between 1895 and 1910, and it was not possible to take a car the whole way to Pittsburgh because Pittsburgh's gauge was different. But pretty much otherwise, you could, if you had an excess amount of time, travel from Buffalo all the way to Detroit or all the way to Chicago, in fact, by trolley car. Now, nobody in their right mind would do that because it would take 10 times longer than taking a steam train, if not more. But a car, I think one or two cars did travel from Utica, New York, which is almost outside the picture in the top right, all the way to, I'm trying to think, they went to Louisville, I believe, down at the bottom, simply as a civic booster project. But it was really amazing to ride a streetcar that far, an interurban car. This is the interurban network around Pittsburgh. It consisted primarily of the Harmony Route 2 lines, which were originally independent but were combined after the First World War, the Pittsburgh Railways Interurbans to Washington and Charleroi, and the West Penn system in the lower right part of the picture. The Interurbans to Butler and Elwood City and Newcastle were given up in 1931. Pittsburgh Railways Interurbans lasted till 1952, and the last West Penn railway lines also lasted until 1952. There was a big difference between these lines. The Harmony route were heavily built, heavy-duty interurban lines. The West Penn was more of a country trolley. It wasn't interurban, but it was of a very rural character, serving mostly very small towns, and it was in what was called the Coke District. We'll talk about it when we get to the West Penn. So this was the Harmony routes after it was combined. The Pittsburgh and Butler Street Railway later combined with the Pittsburgh, Harmony, Butler, and Newcastle. They were operated separately but under common ownership after 1918. The notable thing about Pittsburgh and Butler, also called the Butler Short Line, is that it was built as an alternating current interurban. I am far from an expert on railway electrification, but generally speaking, most lines in the United States built prior to 1905 or thereabouts were 600 volt DC current. That's because DC motors worked well with, and there were no such things as AC motors until after 1895. But there was a lot of problems with economic problems with DC traction on very long lines, notably that they could not have substations midway because it was too hard to transmit DC. So if you wanted a very long DC line, you basically had to have multiple power generating stations. The use of AC came along just after 1900 when George Westinghouse, now I know that there's I'm sure people in European countries like you guys have a different story. So I'm just giving you the American story. Uh, People like Edison, he was wedded to DC. He did not want to be bothered with AC. But George Westinghouse uh, teamed up with Nikola Tesla to develop AC. He thought the future for electrification generally was in AC, and pretty much that turned out to be the case. So a number of lines in the United States, not that many, maybe 30 or so, were built as AC interurbans. And Pittsburgh Short Line was one of them. So it ran on AC, but it could also run on DC because they had to use DC to get into Pittsburgh on Pittsburgh railways. That ended up making a very heavy car with different control apparatus for AC and then DC. And but it did allow a minimum of substations, and the substations did not even have to be attended because they were just simple AC to AC substations, and there were no rotary converters involved to convert AC to DC. So the substations could be much further apart, and they were less complicated than a typical DC substation, which even there the DC had to convert from AC to DC. This had 6,600 volts in the trolley wire alternating current. Very substantially built interurban lines on the Harmony route. The station on the bottom right is in Butler, Pennsylvania, about 35 miles north of Pittsburgh. And the line actually continued all the way up the Harmony route line, all the way to Newcastle, which was 70 some miles from Pittsburgh. Very big, heavy interurban cars. But then the electric railroads got another alternative, and that was the development of 1200-volt DC. And then they could space DC substations much further apart, and with automation, they didn't need to have them attended either. So the bloom was off the rose, so to speak, with AC for interurban lines, and gradually nearly all of the ones that were built were converted to DC, and that's what happened to the Pittsburgh and Butler Street Railway. By 1914, it had been converted to DC. But they kept the pantograph and catenary. They also hauled package freight. So the other part of the Harmony route system was the Pittsburgh, Harmony, Butler, and Newcastle, which ran just like the other one from Pittsburgh to Butler, but there was a line that went from Evans City all the way up to Newcastle, and a branch that went to Beaver. It's not shown on this map, which is right about here. It was a 1200 volt DC. A 1200 volt DC car could run at half speed on 600 volt power. So it was easy enough to get to downtown Pittsburgh. This is just out of the factory. The road was heavily constructed, had many steel bridges, quite substantial steel bridges. It was finished about 1907. The original cars seen here survived to the end of service in 1931. Substation on the left. And that's the main power plant at the other end of the bridge. Pretty substantial. This was the party car. It would be chartered out for groups, and the interior could be rearranged. They also used it to show movies to people inside the car. Elwood City Junction, where the line to Beaver took off, Beaver Falls. Now, this looks like a steel car, but it's not. It's one of the regular wooden cars that had steel plating added in later years. It's the Wexford Station, one of the just typical way stations along the line. They had a lot more stations, actual station buildings, than most interurbans, which use shelters more than stations. This station actually survived the abandonment of the line. The gentleman who was the agent bought the station when the line was abandoned. It got moved around a little bit, but served as a post office and a delicatessen and so on until about 20 years ago. The family that owned it, his children, sold it to the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum, and it was relocated down to the museum, completely restored, and put on a new foundation and air conditioned, and it's a beautiful little piece of work. If you ever get to the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum, make sure you see it. They did get several newer cars in 1914 for the use on the line to Beaver, which was height restricted by railroad bridges and could not take cars of the size of the previous interurban cars. Again, they also had freight service on the Harmony route. Now we go to Pittsburgh Railways. We covered Pittsburgh Railways in the previous two programs, but we just touched on the interurban lines. So that we're going to go into the interurban lines a little bit. Both lines ran to the south of Pittsburgh, started out, went through the tunnel, crossed the river through the tunnel, and then on private right-of-way, mostly all the way to either Washington, which was 29 miles, or to a town, not a town, but an end of line at what's called Elko, which is past Charleroi, down in the lower right corner of the triangle in red. The line survived a very long time, and they were both abandoned in May and August of 1953. But the portions within Allegheny County were retained, and so the library line came south to right here, and the Drake line came south to about right here. And those lines ran with PCC cars until 1999, and they are now serviced by light rail. And on the right is a map in more detail showing not all of the stops, but a good many of them. Pittsburgh Railways used hand-me-down cars from its predecessor companies in the beginning of service on these lines, but in 1910 bought a dozen or so of these big, heavy interurban cars. This is a typical interurban that you would have seen in Illinois, Indiana, Ohio. It's they never bought another car quite like these big wood cars. In 1917, they bought low-floor steel cars for interurban service, building on their program at that time to convert the entire system to low-floor cars. Pittsburgh was one of the very first cities in the United States to utilize low-floor cars, and they were able to do that by virtue of working with Westinghouse Electric to develop much smaller motors that would allow the floor level of the car to be brought down closer to the street. And they used what were called baby motors at the time. They were about 2/3 of the size of the big motors on the previous cars. In 1925, Pittsburgh Railways bought another set of about 20 low-floor cars of more modern design, and this resembled the low-floor cars used in city service, Although when these were built, they had a lavatory aboard, and that was removed after the Interurbans were abandoned. They didn't really like these cars that much. So in 1928, they bought another dozen St. Louis car streamline cars, which were the reputed to be the best cars that ever ran in Pittsburgh. Here's one downtown on Grant Street. And then finally, in 1949, they still were running the Interurbans. Pittsburgh Railways was bankrupt, as it had been since 1938, and the reorganization of Pittsburgh Railways included the abandonment as soon as possible of the Interurbans. So these cars were nevertheless bought, knowing that they could easily be used in city service after the Interurbans were abandoned. So the Pittsburgh and Lake Erie Railroad Station on the south bank of the Monongahela River. We're at the south end of the Smithfield Street Bridge. The railroad had built that nice portico type structure on the right so that passengers coming from the railroad trains could come up from the track level and cross the street without getting wet. Very nice. It was torn down in the 60s, but the clock was preserved and is at the Pennsylvania Railroad Museum today. Here's the south end of the South Hills Trolley Tunnel. The tunnel was built on a 6% grades, 3,600 feet long. This is south end where the lines diverged to the east and west sides of Mount Washington or Coal Hill, and the lines to Dormont, Brookline, Castle Shannon, and the Interurbans. The Charleroi car making a loop probably just came out of the car house. The track arrangement was such that cars could be sent from any direction in any direction using connecting tracks at the junction. You can still get on a light rail car right here, but it looks a whole lot different. One of my shots coming out of South Hills Junction in the wintertime in the early 1960s. Brand new 1700s sit at the car house, South Hills Junction. South Hills had two car houses, one for city cars and one for the interurban cars. Down at the south end of the yard at South Hills Junction, you see the two buildings up in the center top were maintenance away structures. Then the cars would come across the bridge over Palm Garden and divide, and some would go to Mount Lebanon and some would go to Dormont. And up here is the old steam railroad right-of-way, which was converted to trolley for the Overbrook line. This was recently, well, I say recently, about 20 years ago, was rebuilt for light rail operation. Oops. Here you see a car up on the former railroad right-of-way above the Liberty tubes, which were completed in 1928 and were the first big road tunnel in Pittsburgh. Well, not the first, but one of the first double bore road tunnel in Pittsburgh. Here it's at along Sawmill Run Boulevard, several high bridges. This is less than 2 miles from downtown Pittsburgh, but it looks like it's out in the middle of the country. This is at Glenberry Street on the way to Castle Shannon. That structure on the right was a remnant of the steam railroad days, a little Glenberry Street station. Now we're in Castle Shannon. 3700 type car coming south into town, and a 1700 car heading south past the former car house. This car house was built in the 1920s, but in 1936 or 7 it was closed. Just found that it was too expensive to operate in the Depression years, and it was later converted into the town hall. It's since been demolished. Now, you remember I told you that building where the steam railroad coaches were sticking out? This is the same building after conversion to a car barn for the Interurban. That's the 3600s and one 3700. A little bit south of Castle Shannon is Washington Junction, where the lines to Washington and Charleroi diverge. That big hill up above is a bony pile, which is refuse from coal mines. Uh, there was a big mine here up until the 1950s. By the 60s, Southwest Junction looked like this. It's looking south towards Charleroi, and you see all the miner housing since converted to private use. In January of 1960, I was in high school, freshman, and I finally made it out. I took a streetcar out to library. It's the last long remnant of the Charleroi Interurban, and this was taken on that day. The line continued on through the streets of Finleyville and then down towards New Eagle, passing under the Pittsburgh and West Virginia Railway here. This is kind of the character of the line and the Washington line, mostly private right of way, but adjacent to highways. It's about to come down to the banks of the Monongahela River, which is followed from Pittsburgh, but several miles apart from it. In Monongahela. This is the largest city along the between Pittsburgh and Charleroi. And then at Black Diamond Junction, just south of Monongahela, there was another junction here. The car on the right is coming up from Charleroi, and the car on the left, I would say it's coming up from Donora, but I'm not sure that it could come up from Donora because it would have had, I think it would have had to back all the way to Donora, which is several miles. There was no loop in Donora, but there might have been, I meant to check this but forgot to do it. There might have been a Y at the old freight station in Donora, maybe. So it could have Y'd there to come back up. The local service on Donora consisted of one car or maybe two, which ran a shuttle from Black Diamond, from New Eagle through Monongahela out to Donora. All these towns were, mill towns. From Black Diamond Junction, the car went up a long, long hill to Eldora, where the summit was uh, almost as high as the highest point on any line, which was about 1,200 feet above sea level, and then descended through rough country to Charleroi. Several very large steel bridges along the way. Now, this picture, there is a streetcar line in it. If you go over on the right edge, you'll see a line about a third of the way down the page, skirting along the side of the hill, going over a bridge, then another bridge, as it gradually descended into Charleroi. These bridges were pretty impressive stuff. When the line was abandoned, as was told to me in 1953, they dynamited the bridges to bring them down. Across the river is the Monessen Works of the Pittsburgh Steel Company. It was a big steel mill in its day, but it's history now. Now we're entering Charleroi. On the right is a car house, but it's not a Pittsburgh Railways car house. It's the West Side line, which went over across the river to Monessen and to a point in from the river several miles beyond the south end of Charleroi. It used Pittsburgh Railways to get across up to the area where it crossed over the river. Pittsburgh Railways car barn is the building beyond the coal company trestle on the left with the arched roof. That building survived, still survives. It was converted into a supermarket, and I'm not really sure what it's used for today, but it's still there. downtown Charleroi. Once past Charleroi, the line paralleled the river and the Pennsylvania Railroad's Monongahela branch. Although you've seen some double tracking, the private right-of-way track on both Charleroi and Washington was primarily single track with passing sidings. We're almost down to Elko Loop. This is Downs Grocery, which was just north of the end of the line. On the right, in the far distance, you can see a car down at Elko Loop. That was the southernmost point of the Charleroi line. Now we switch over to the Washington line. This track here, there's still a track here, two of them in fact. When the light rail line was built to South Hills Junction in the early 1980s, this was totally rebuilt. You know, it's now double track, all the steel poles and wiring. It's a very much upgraded rail line. When the Washington line got to what was called Drake, it passed over this trestle, which later was removed when the line was cut back to Drake. Instead, off to the right, where you can't see it, there was a spur track that descended down to the location underneath this bridge, and a very tight loop was constructed there, and that's where the Drake cars terminated. The last couple miles of the Drake line did not get included in the rebuilding of the part that is today's light rail line. So the track is still there, but it hasn't been used in many years, and the wire has been removed. The thing I want to point out of the Pittsburgh Interurbans is that there were towns along the way, but they were generally small, and most of the land along the interurban was farmland, and it was pretty light on traffic. Lots of very pretty scenery, but not much patronage. When the reorganization of Pittsburgh Railways was being done prior to 1950, it was already baked into the reorganization that the interurban lines would be abandoned. They were losing about $400,000 a year, which back then was real money. And the railways wanted out, and they knew that they could use the cars. So it was included in the reorganization plan. The interurbans would be closed, and also that all short shuttle lines in the city, which use double end cars, would be abandoned as well or converted to bus. Gives you an idea of the character of the line. I wish I'd have seen it. This area has now grown up unbelievably. This is at Cannonsburg, about 8 miles north of the final Washington end of the line. Now, of all the slides you'll see, or pictures you'll see, there's only a couple where you can say the streetcars still run today, and that's a streetcar like this actually still runs. This is taken on what is today the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum's line at Meadowlands, Pennsylvania. The track is still exactly the same as you see it here without the weeds. Still has signals, and we still run a trolley line here. In the summer, there's an event called the County Fair, which in the days of Pittsburgh Railways, it was quite busy here. This is a very long siding the car sits on, and many cars would be parked in there to handle the break of the when the fair closed at night. And we still haul people to the fair over this line. The car's headed towards the fair in this particular case. The difference between then and now is the nice park-like area to the left, which was then the Washington County Home for Elderly Men, is now an industrial park. So it doesn't look quite like this, but the part that survives is those concrete stairs on the right. They're still there, and we still can stop there. Tylerdale Car House, just outside of Washington. From here, the line was double track into the city, and Washington was noted for having the last small town streetcar line in the United States. We're still at Tylerdale here, but in here is the Washington streetcars nearing the terminal. Car is pulled into the terminal and it will get out by backing up and moving forward in front of us. As I said, there was a little streetcar system of 3 lines in Washington. They all used double end cars. They had no loops, so they could not use single end cars. As I say, this survived along with the Interurbans till 1953, and it's reputed to have been the last real small town trolley system in the United States. Here's a local car. Van trip. Pittsburgh Railways also had a freight business. They had these very nicely appearing freight cars that ran primarily on the interurban lines. Okay, now we go to the West Penn. West Penn was really something. It was a big operation at one time. Uh, the pink area was Wheeling Traction, which was owned by the West Penn from fairly short time in the 1920s. They did own the main line, which was the Panhandle Traction Company from Wheeling to Steubenville. That ran until 1933. The other lines were sold, the ones that survived at that point were sold to the employees and ran as a private company until 1948, converted to bus. The other lines are this purple line, which is West Penn, but is disconnected from the main line, and it was the Oakdale and McDonald Street Railway, abandoned in the 1920s. The Allegheny Valley along the Allegheny River, which started out as an independent company but came under West Penn control quite early. It was abandoned in 1937, and then 2 other routes, Leechburg to Apollo and Ford City to Katanning, which were separate but used West Penn type equipment, were abandoned in 1936. The big operation was always the Coke region lines, shown here in the yellow area, and we'll talk extensively about them. This is Oakdale and McDonald. It was isolated, planned to be extended, but never was. It was kind of a lost leader and was abandoned quite early. Now let's talk about the Coke region. The red on the right shows where the ground contains huge deposits of bituminous coal. It was found that the area in the Connellsville Coke field, which is in the circled area, contained about the best possible bituminous coal to be used for making coke. Coke is coal that has been burned in ovens to drive off all the impurities, and what's left is called coke. It has nothing to do with Coca-Cola. And coke was and to some extent still is used in blast furnaces as part of the process of producing liquid iron, which in turn is sent through a converter and made into steel. Anyway, that there were literally zillions, I think, well, it seemed like zillions, of small towns associated with coal mines and coke ovens in the Coke region. And that's what West Penn was primarily built to serve. typical coke oven arrangement in the 1880s. From mine to coke oven to railroad car to steel mill. Dirty, dirty work, and very debilitating with all that gas being given off. I call your attention to the sign on the right, danger, and then, well, I can see German and possibly it might be Italian, you tell me. I can't account for the rest of them, but there was a huge influx of European labor which gravitated to the coke mines and coke plants, and it was tough work. The Pennsylvania Railroad station at Greensburg on the main line at the north end of the field had an immigrant waiting room separate from the main waiting room. And it's unfortunate that things like that existed, but that's the way it was. Typical coke mine town, all owned by the company, rented out. And right in front of us is a trolley line of the West Penn. So the towns shown in green boxes are the larger towns. And except for McKeesport, they weren't that large. They were in the neighborhood of 20 to 30,000 people. Everything else was much, much, much smaller. The pink area is what was considered the main line of the West Penn Railways. It extended from Greensburg through Mount Pleasant to Connellsville to Uniontown, and that was the primary route. There were also a lot of cars that went up to Latrobe and to Trafford, where the connection was. One of the connections were with Pittsburgh Railways, right here. There's also a connection with Pittsburgh Railways at Duquesne, but they gave up the Trafford, the Irwin right here line here in 1938. The abandonment was a gradual process, starting with the other lines, but this particular line, as well as Latrobe and a little short line at Connellsville to South Connellsville, survived until the summer of 1952. Like most cities, areas, it started out around about 1900 with cars like this. This was the first electric railway in the West Penn territory, Greensburg and Hempfield, little local service. Eventually grew to longer lines going out into the country. Cars gradually got bigger, lines were extended. This is at Larimer on the line between Irwin and Trafford, crossing the main line of the Pennsylvania Railroad. The interurban cars, the first true interurbans were the 200s. A little wet. They had a fair number of single truck cars used in the various short lines in the towns and to the amusement parks. Then the 600s came around along early after 1900, but it wasn't too long before the West Penn developed its characteristic center entrance car, the 700s, which came to be the standard car on the West Penn. They had 40 of them, and they bought some from Cincinnati, and they bought some made from parts provided by Cincinnati, and they made them in their own shops in Connellsville. The newest cars were the 800s, formerly on the Allegheny Valley Railroad, the separate line going up along the Allegheny River that had been absorbed into the West Penn. When the Valley route was abandoned in 1937, these cars ran on their own wheels down into Pittsburgh, then back out through the east end of Pittsburgh and the eastern suburbs to reach the West Penn at Trafford. After 1942, that couldn't have been done, as the West Penn line into Trafford was abandoned in 1942. West Penn was a pretty classy operation for a country trolley. It was affiliated, actually, it kind of grew out. It was a creation of a company called West Penn. The West Penn Railways initially sold electricity to the public, as many interurbans did. Eventually, the power company became West Penn Electric, and it dwarfed the trolley line itself. Eventually, the West Penn Railways had to be divorced from West Penn Power because of antitrust laws. But when West Penn was going, they built nice new stations in Greensburg, Connellsville, and Uniontown. Very, very well planned out stations. And this is the Greensburg station. Cars left the station in Greensburg and is heading uphill across the four-track main line of the Pennsylvania Railroad. It's only two tracks here today, but that station, fully restored, is still there. Continued on its way to Jeannette towards Trafford, passing Seton Hill College. My cousin attended Seton Hill College. Now we're in Jeannette, noted for its glass factories, generally parallel to the main line of the Pennsylvania, and again, mostly side of the road line, which had to have a track in the street at passing sidings. This is after 1942, actually, probably after 1946, when the line had been cut back to Irwin. As a side note, in that part of Pennsylvania, right where that last picture was taken, there is a street named Interurban Street. This is the end of the line in Irwin. It used to continue from behind the car across a bridge towards Trafford. This is past that bridge. Arriving at Trafford, it connected with the Pittsburgh Railways Company. Uh, Cars did not operate, passenger cars did not operate through between the West Penn and Pittsburgh Railways. It was always a walking transfer at Trafford. Um, an exception to that was freight cars, which we'll talk about in a couple minutes. They did operate through all the way to Pittsburgh. As I might have said, the McKeesport line was abandoned early in 1938. That included this little section. This was a very long suburban line out of McKeesport to Boston, Pennsylvania, and onward to Versailles, and I forget the last name, but the last part of the line crossed this bridge at Boston. It's a big cantilever bridge, one of the largest bridges in western Pennsylvania at the time, not on one of the major rivers. This is on the Youghiogheny River, and I'll give a prize to anyone who can spell Youghiogheny. Back to Greensburg, we're going to head south on the main line. That's the West Penn Station on the left. It also served as offices for the power company. Funny thing about the West Penn, the cars generally didn't look that great, but they were very well maintained. The story is that on the last day of service, the maintenance crews were out still oiling switches on the main line. And when they built that station, Greensburg, they also built a freight station. Both of those buildings survive. The passenger station is the city hall for Greensburg, and I don't know what they use this building for, but it is in use. This freight station still looks just like that. Rolling down the street in Greensburg, and then you're out in the rural countryside going from one coal mine to the next. Hecla Junction, where the line went to Latrobe, took off. The car on the right is leaving the junction. It's going to run up to Latrobe. And here is the bridge that car would enter just after that picture we just saw. This was a fan trip after the Latrobe line had been abandoned, but before the main line was abandoned. And it was only a very short time between those two events. This is as far as they could go. The power was off halfway down the bridge. And this is entering Latrobe, crossing the Loyal Hanna River. End of the line at the car house in Latrobe. This was a very small car house that they did use for emergencies, I think, but they had very little reason to, unless it was the first car south in the morning, to leave a car in Latrobe. This is across the street from the Rolling Rock Brewery, which some of you may be familiar with. This is at Standard, Pennsylvania, where the Henry Clay Frick Coke Company had 999 coke ovens. It shows the close relationship between the West Penn and the coal mining industry. Mount Pleasant. It's the last major capital improvement on the West Penn. The line used to just go straight across here on the ground, but it was found necessary to put a bridge in. Now, why would they put a bridge in? And here's a view of the cars sitting on the bridge. You notice down in the lower right corner, there's a speeding automobile. This was a bridge over the Pennsylvania Turnpike, completed in 1940, and was the first long distance limited access highway in the United States. This is just off the bridge at Iron Bridge. We'll talk about the West Penn was almost exclusively single track with many passing sidings, and we'll talk about how they regulated that before long. It was signaled, sort of. Now we're in Connellsville, the heart of the West Penn and the site of the main shops and offices. The nice streamlined car from the Valley routes now relettered West Penn and are serving out their lives on the South Connellsville shuttle, a very short line that went down to a major glass plant. They generally had one 800 and one 200 on that line. And off to the right, you can tell the date of this because the Dawson line was converted from rail in 1950. So this is sometime probably in 1950 or 51. There's the Connellsville station. On the shuttle. Connellsville shops and main car house. Pretty extensive buildings arrangement. They had everything there they needed to do, whatever they wanted to do. It's actually, parts of it are still in existence. The rest of that complex there was West Penn Power Electric business, and they still use that. West Penn is still in operation as an electric utility under that name. These cars were built in the 1920s. This is an older car, one of the very few older cars that lasted till after World War World War II. I think its primary use was for fan trips. That's the 832, which lives today at the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum in as-built condition. Naturally, they had to have snow sweepers, and they even had a rotary snowplow. This is a locomotive. It was used in the shop area on three-rail track in order to switch standard gauge railroad freight cars. The coupler could be moved within its pocket to accommodate standard gauge cars. And it's this picture on the right is taken at the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum. Freight business. Pittsburgh Railways and West Penn in 1924 formed a company called Consolidated Electric Freight, and it ran directly from Pittsburgh over the streetcar system to Trafford, and then to Greensburg, Uniontown, and Latrobe. And it had the shops built these freight motors, many of which survived. The freight business was abandoned in 1941. I'll show you why in a second. But many of the cars survived in work service for some years thereafter, all the way up to the end. But the freight business only lasted from 1924 to 1941. Here you can see a couple freight motors on the left down on the lower right, and one on the street over in the inset. This building was the old Pittsburgh Exposition Building, sort of for huge industrial fairs. And in 1941, it was condemned by the city. And with it being condemned, the Pittsburgh Railways and West Penn gave up the interurban freight business. Down at Connellsville, the main station, power station, was built. It's not on the trolley line, but it's a mile or so off the line. And it had typical, to begin with, large reciprocating steam engines driving generators. Later on, they were replaced by turbines, and eventually this building was expanded to about twice its size. It was torn down about 40 years ago. End of the line in Dawson, Dickerson Run, actually. Dawson had to walk across the bridge to get to Dawson. And a shuttle going out there, the same place. Typical of the West Penn, you know, always a coal mine in sight. Now we're going south of Connellsville. This is near Dunbar. Descending the hill, or actually he's ascending the hill in Dunbar. Here, take a minute to talk about the signal system. It was all single track, nearly all, and they needed lots of curves and hills, and they really needed some system to prevent collisions. So the West Penn had regular light bulbs, which you see here. There'd be two light bulbs in a housing at each end of every siding in each direction, and they had these paddles. This is the paddle switches here. The motorman, upon arriving at this location, the motorman would turn off the light for the section, the block, if you will, back to the previous siding, flip a paddle, turn off the light, and then he would flip the other paddle and turn on the lights for the next section. And that was the extent of signaling on the West Penn. Had no connection to the car whatsoever, except that the operator had to lean out of the window to do this. And it was actually very effective, very simple, and it worked. You know, collisions were very rare on the West Penn. Very primitive signaling system, but something that worked. Probably the finest of the 700s was the Fay West. It too was a party car type of arrangement. It's a regular car that was turned into the party car. This car, 739, also is at the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum today. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like this, although I understand that at least one side of it's to be painted as an exhibit. Ultimately, everyone it's probably my highest car on my list that I'd like to see restored, but there's a lot of work involved. We're still heading out to towards Brownsville, crossing a coal mine railroad. Funny, it doesn't even have a signal to go across. How does it know? And this is the Uniontown station. It's all the stations, the three, Uniontown, Connellsville, and Greensburg, are repurposed and are still there today. Now, this is on the street in Uniontown. Okay, this is not a West Penn car. Until some years ago, there was a freight spur in Uniontown that had very little train traffic on it. And the railroad allowed a fan group that had use of this RDC car. And in the around 2008, I think, there was a fan trip and it ran down the street. So it's considered a substitute West Penn car. Meanwhile, we're headed out to Brownsville and Martin. These lines were kind of weak. Fan trip near Brownsville Junction, and all the way down to Fairchance, which was the extreme southern end of the West Penn. This was a shuttle line that actually connected with another line. We'll talk about that in a minute. This is the brake system of a 700. It was electric brakes. There were no air brakes on the 700s. So the track brake would be turned on, it would clamp down, and through a series of linkages would apply the tread brakes on the wheels. So when the car was stopped, there was no way to apply the brake. So the motorman would wind up a big gooseneck handbrake to hold the car. Here's a map you've seen before, and we already talked about this same thing, so I'll skip over that. This is the Allegheny Valley Railroad, which ran from Aspinwall near Pittsburgh to New Kensington and up to Tarentum. This is the line that ran till 1937. We're just looking at a couple of the other lines. Here's an ad the West Penn and Westinghouse put out when the Valley line got the new cars. Here you can see an operator flipping a paddle switch. Brand new car on display. Now we're on the Ford City line up in the blue on the map. These lines were given up in 1936. Very short shuttle lines. And another one, Apollo to Leechburg along the Conemaugh River. The West Penn connected with a number of other lines, circled and identified in red there. Very short country trolleys, but some interesting stuff in there nonetheless. Fairchance and Smithfield only had 2 or 3 cars. It never made it to Smithfield. It just ran from Fairchance out to a coal mine. Westmoreland County Railway was between Latrobe, where it connected with the West Penn, to Derry, which was the site of a very large Pennsylvania Railroad operation, and also a porcelain plant that produced millions and millions of insulators used by the electric railway business. Now, this is not commonly known, I guess, because even people that I thought knew about this didn't know about it. And what they didn't know is, what do you think on the upper left picture? Notice the trolley base and the devices next to the 2 things sticking out on each side of each trolley base. What could that be? Well, it turned out upon really extensive research that the Westmoreland County Railways was built as an alternating current interurban, the second in the United States. It was only 7 miles long. And why in the world did they decide to do 1,250 volt alternating current? That mystery was not solved, but it could have been that Westinghouse at the time was very much involved in advancing the cause of AC electrification. And Westinghouse was not far away. In fact, was a major customer of that porcelain plant. So maybe they just convinced somebody that it would be a good idea to electrify this little 4-car, 7-mile trolley line with AC. Anyway, that's what happened. It only lasted maybe 7 or 8 years. The cars were sold off then, and replacement DC cars were put on. The sold off cars were sold to the West Penn. The AC electrification was removed, and they were turned into West Penn cars, conventional DC, which you see here down below. A 611 is a former car of the Westmoreland County Railways, and it survived till after World War II. Another line was the Irwin Hermity Traction Company, about 5 miles long on the line to Trafford. And the Tarentum, Brackenridge, and Butler, impressive name, was about 3 miles long, used some of the former West Penn cars, and actually survived the abandonment of the Allegheny Valley line with which it connected. It ran until 1940. Little map that shows the dissolution of West Penn. The red lines were abandoned by 1952. The yellow lines were abandoned in, well, before 1950, I should say. And the yellow lines were abandoned in 1950-51. The green lines survived until 1952. And buses were put on the main line and a couple of the shuttle lines, but the West Penn had very poor success as a bus operation. And in 1953, the bus company portion of the West Penn was sold to private operators. Today, there's extremely little public transportation in that part of Pennsylvania. Final shot, crossing the bridge over the turnpike, the new and the old. And that's it. Thanks for watching.